Hello, welcome to How to Win Friends and Influence People on Slack. It's about being a remote employee at a hybrid company. I hope this is pretty relevant to people in this area. I think a lot of us come from more rural places and there aren't as many office employment opportunities. So I think more and more people I talk to around here work remotely, and a lot of those work opportunities are at companies that have offices, and where maybe the majority of people be in an office, or a lot of the people will be in an office. I have about 10 years of software development experience. I have mostly worked in office settings. Coincidentally, I started working remotely in like February of 2020, so it happened to correspond really well with the COVID lockdowns. Felt lucky for that reason, but obviously, like, my experience of remote working is heavily influenced by COVID, I think, as many people have experienced as well. Yeah.
So you didn't actually name there.
I didn't. Oh, well, my name's Clayton Salem.
Yeah,
Remote work is in the news. Forbes loves to have articles about how terrible remote work is. And I just sort of took a bunch of like titles and stuff and threw them up there. The more I talk to individual people about this, the more opinions and interesting things I hear. And I kind of wish that this would have been like an open forum more than just me talking, because what you're going to hear is anecdotes. Like, this is just my experience, and I think there's a lot that people have to say. And in essence, this is about communicating, and it's about how we communicate through these digital spaces. And these articles are all clickbaity. Why would you trust me? I don't know. I do have some. I've been able to put myself into leadership positions at the companies I've worked at. And some of that is skill, but honestly, most of it is just my personality. I put myself out there, and people like, hey, he knows what he's talking about. So I led a creation of a custom e-commerce platform, and currently I work at a large enterprise company, and I am on like a leadership track there. This is a huge issue, which is that, like, I sit at the middle of the demographic, center of especially software development. I'm white, male. The age one I am getting further away from now, but and so, like, again, this is my anecdotes. This is how things that have worked for me. I think that it will not be the same for everyone, and I don't mean to say like you can't do the things that I'm talking about, but to take everything I say with a grain of salt. Some of my other advantages: native English speaker, East Coast time zone is very helpful, college education, able-bodied. The time zone one is very interesting. I've got a lot of colleagues in India, so we have like 2 hours of overlap, and that's like a huge challenge. What does all this have to do with remote work? Well, here's the basic thesis: is that I'm saying is that remote workers we're at a disadvantage for promotion and advancement, and just like learning things from colleagues. However, we can use the modern tool set to make ourselves more visible, more well heard, and to sort of overcome those natural disadvantages. I'm saying what you can do is call attention to yourself. And I think that for me personally, I can take bigger swings. Like, I can take bigger risks in public. The consequences for me putting my foot in my mouth are, I think, less. And I think that's just something we have to acknowledge and understand. I don't like attention. I actually don't really like attention that much. And I think that there's a whole world of software developers who do not do what I'm advocating for. They live quietly, they develop great software, and they have very successful careers, and there's no reason that you need to make yourself a character or make yourself an influencer at work. However, it's also not all about you. I think where I've seen the most success is when I've been able to open the door for colleagues and like take a chat that was dead, that was quiet, and ask questions and make myself vulnerable. And that's like led to other people asking questions and being like, hey, how does this work? How does this work? You know, admitting that you don't know something is really powerful. Basically breaks down to this, right? So know thyself, know who you are, know your own foibles, know your own limitations, know your strengths, and then know thy neighbors. Like in this case, we're talking about your colleagues at work, right? Know the audience, know who other people are. I thought this talk would be kind of boring, so this is what they call intrusive thoughts. All right, in the chat. So this is going to talk about Slack, Teams, things like that. So group chats, or group channels. We want to talk about things like subject matter, who the audience is, where's the edge of appropriate, and where's the edge of like normal. So who's in this channel? Pretty obvious, right? Like, are these all developers? Is there a mix of developers and managers? Is the CEO in here? Definitely something to keep in mind and be aware of. That said, always treat all digital communication as if it's permanent. Even if the CEO isn't there, they could see it. And they might not, they probably won't, but like, yeah, just don't ever say anything that you wouldn't want the CEO to see. Subject matter, I think in Slack this is very easy. There's often like the title of the chat, of the channel, right? Like, is this about PHP? Is this about this particular client? Is this about this particular feature? And then looking at like what the content is. What do people actually discuss in the channel? What's the tone? Do people make jokes? Is it all serious in business? This is my edge of appropriate, edge of normal. I think what I would aim for is to actually hover somewhere between normal and appropriate. You don't always want to be the center of attention, but you do want to break out of like the normal box of like what the chat is about. It's how you call attention to yourself. That's for making more jokes, asking more questions, etc. You don't want to go outside of what's appropriate, right? I think people get fired for what they say at work, and that's what we want to avoid. All right, this is probably the like superpower is asking questions in public chats. Technical questions are you know, I think it is really hard for us to admit when we don't know things, but doing so in a public space gets you an answer, and also you know, provides that answer to other people who might have that same questions. I do try to be very careful with how I construct the questions, very self-conscious. If you ever ask questions on Stack Overflow, they're very like rigorous about like, you know, people will like downvote you for not being clear or whatever. You don't have to be that crazy careful, but you do have to. I do think it's helpful if you like write out what you're going to ask. And sometimes I'll just write it out and then figure out the answer myself. Don't be afraid to look ignorant. Ignorant's probably the wrong word. Don't be afraid to look like you don't know what you're doing, right? I think I've worked with people in situations where they were clearly afraid of not knowing things. And I would ask questions, and people would answer, and I would get really confused because I didn't understand the answer, and I would like come back to it, and eventually I would figure out the answer and be like, they didn't know what they were talking about. And it's such a waste of my time and theirs to not admit when you don't know things. Also, people love to share what they know. So like, let people tell you what they know. This is something that I definitely struggle with a little bit. Like if I can jump ahead of someone, like they start answering, I'm like, oh, I get it now. But like, it's really important to like sit back and like let them talk. And if you don't understand something, there's a good chance someone else doesn't either. And again, that's part of that opening the door is like, uh, you know, if they don't feel comfortable asking the question in public, you can, and have their answer questions. So share what you know. People do love to share what you know. Contribute conversations. This one I struggle with. So I have this habit of like getting into chats and wanting to like talk to people, so I do tend to jump on like every question. I have to pump the brakes. So if you get to a place where you're very verbal on Slack, just keep that in mind as well. Talking about your feelings. So this one is, I don't have a good example. I wish I had a good example of this, but obviously I think it works better in smaller groups. You don't talk a ton about your feelings in big groups. And it's not a therapy session. This is not like talking about your deep-held emotional problems. But really talking about feelings is super powerful, and people respond really well to it. Positive feelings, people want to cheer you on, right? Hey, I'm really excited about delivering this feature or this thing I found, and people like to cheer that on. Negative feelings can be very powerful as well. You can build sympathy. I find it's best to do it like a little self-deprecating, but that's just me. All right, and then direct messages, obviously hugely important part of developing online relationships is like, direct messaging people. There's less social risk, obviously. I do always still keep in mind that idea that like these messages could end up on the front door, on the table of HR, right? Things don't want to get too personal. This is workspace. We're talking about workplace. We're still talking about, and then also like be time sensitive, right? Like some people are super busy, and you don't want to take up all their time. If you put it in group chatter, they can ignore it much easier than if you're direct messaging them. I use Teams. It's terrible. It's really bad. And part of the problem, I think, is some of this other stuff about like subject matter and audience. It's not made very clear. Everything, it's the way we use Teams is like everyone ends up in these direct message chats. They end up siloed. When I say channels in Teams, it's really just a group chat. So the subject matter isn't always clear. You're not always clear if you should leave once you stop talking about whatever you started talking about. And even worse, like there might be chats that you're not involved in and you have no way of knowing. There's no like, hey, is everyone talking about React? And like, you don't know. And then they're ephemeral. If it's a meeting chat and the manager of the meeting goes on, then that chat is gone. The place I work, they actually delete messages every 2 weeks. So you can't put information there. So yeah, Teams is terrible. All right, Zoom. So let's talk about video. So Zoom just mean like any video chat, right? I think the big question is video on or off. Video on if you can, right? They say 55% of face-to-face communication is nonverbal. So when we're together, more than half of our communication is nonverbal. So we can get a little bit of that back by having video on. I don't really think you can get that much nonverbal from video, but there's a little, right? However, this happens all the time, right? Like you're the one person with the camera on and nobody else has it on. It's super uncomfortable. I don't stick it on. If I don't like stick it out, I like basically wait a few seconds or a minute, and then I will turn my video off. I'm not that comfortable with it. And talk about putting your cameras on, right? Like bring it up as a piece of conversation. We currently, I think that the management has said like, hey, you guys need to turn your cameras on during meetings. Of course, we're not actually doing it. I don't know. Hopefully we'll get there. All right, this is just like tips about light and sound, right? And I think that there's people who can give you much better ideas of how to light yourself better. Put the light behind the camera, basically up here. I think I have a diagram that I drew. Headsets are an easier solution to good sound. I have a headset that I use all the time. and do your own research on this stuff. But here's my setup. And my wife said people love QR codes, so there's a QR code for the list of stuff I use. I use a primary light. I do have ambient ceiling lights. I work in a basement, so my lighting situation is challenging. And so I definitely have a primary light for my desk. I have some LED strips, a headset, external monitors, docks, and KVM switches. I have this problem, and if I have dark mode on my computer, I look decent. This is not a great picture, but decent, right? However, if I go to a website that does not have dark mode, I end up like this. I'm just going to leave this up here because it's such a good picture. Funny anecdote. I work on a Windows computer for work, and I really do have this problem. I'll look washed out and blue and terrible if my screens are white. I plugged in my MacBook to get these pictures, and it just worked, and it looks fine. It's this is not what it looks like at work. So it's a thing. All right. Well, during video talks, during calls, right? You've got interruptions and pauses. I think these are big challenges. I think some of the advice that I've heard is check in before changing topics. It becomes a little tedious. You hear people saying, does anybody else have anything to say? But it kind of works. And then be direct, not talking around issues and talking directly to them is important. All right, and so holding open the door, right? I think I've framed most of this around promoting yourself. And that's really where this idea comes from, is hey, you can make yourself visible, you can make yourself known, and that's gonna help you. However, I think that the best experience comes when you can think of it as the way to open doors for other people, and that's not just going to benefit you; it's going to benefit them and the group your group and workplace in general. Be present, temper yourself. Don't jump into every chat. And create a welcoming space. I like this idea. We're all large animals, even if we don't eat meat. We come from prey animals, so you got to rest. Lions rest all the time, so you can rest too. That's it. It's a little short, but any questions?
Yeah, I'll just chime in and say that I am that person who tends to leave my camera on even when other people do not have theirs on, and eventually it tends to make at least some other people uncomfortable enough that they turn theirs on because I leave mine on.
I applaud you. That's awesome. Glad it works. Yeah.
Is it occasionally useful to have calls that are deliberately audio only, just to reduce Zoom fatigue for people?
Yeah, that sounds like a good idea to me. If you have plenty of video on calls, then absolutely, yeah. I think traditional phone calls are very comfortable that way. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
So Slack has a feature where you can join a channel as essentially you join the audio of the channel, almost as if you are hanging out in the Slack channel. And one thing I've done when I was taking over for the team lead of another team is spend a number of hours just in the channel passively. The thing I was attempting to signal was, hey, if you need to, I am around. If you need help,
Nice.
I am around.
So is this an audio channel that people could just jump into and start talking?
Yeah.
Nice. Cool.
And I guess I was just curious if that's useful or if that.
Sounds good to me. Yeah, Teams doesn't have that, but yeah, that's cool.
Mm-hmm.
Nice.
What's your experience with meetings where the share of conversation is really imbalanced and some people are speaking a lot, some people are speaking a little?
Yeah, I'm usually one of the ones speaking too much,
Uh-huh.
and I don't know how to solve that problem. I think especially with video off, I don't even know who's not speaking often. Yeah. Go ahead.
When you have the diagram of kind of normal behaviors and appropriate behaviors, I feel like a lot of those tend to rest on a homogenous workplace of existing, like having people who are culture fits,
Yep.
and not necessarily culture adds.
Yep.
I know that you've like noted that you're like, these results might be different from people of like marginalized backgrounds.
Yep.
As someone from not a marginalized background who it sounds like is in a position of leadership, how would you suggest or how have you approached trying to like expand those boundaries for culture adds that
Yeah.
might not fit within what your current normal is?
Yeah, I'm not sure how to answer that question. I think by emphasizing that like we have these boundaries and maybe like trying to push out into those borderlands, maybe I can help lead that a little bit. I don't know, but I think that's definitely like the question that I'm trying to get to. Yeah. Go ahead.
A question I have that is about that is so a company will have a company culture, like value statement, and also will have sort of symbols and memes that get repeated in the company culture as just things that have been accumulated. And one thing I've wondered is, does explicitly aligning with those serve to make it easier for people who are maybe more on a skin deep level culturally different, offer them a path to feeling part of the culture? Because like let's imagine that Start With Why is one of the listed company culture values, right?
Okay.
Anyone can do that, right? Is that something that you found useful to do, things that explicitly follow the listed company culture?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to someone else's experience aligning themselves. Yeah, I'm not sure. I think, like, you know, we spend a lot of the time in workplaces, right? We spend a lot of time in these workspaces, but they're not our homes. Although this is the whole point, right? We've basically brought the workplace to home. So, yeah, I mean, for me, I tend to try to push those boundaries of normal a little bit far. I try to not align myself with necessarily the company culture. It's partly my own personality, partly because I see the boundary areas where people are excluded, and I want to try to expand them if I can. That wouldn't really answer your question, but...
I'm kind of curious, like, what do you do to expand boundaries, but not overstep boundaries?
Yeah, I think, yeah, I didn't really get to that part. Mostly, I think talking about myself and being very clear on who I am and where my weaknesses are, and admitting those weaknesses in public. That's like, you know, making it personal is the only way I know how to do that. Yeah.
And this would be in a culture where people aren't so used to being vulnerable?
Yeah. Yeah, I think like big enterprise people are not used to being vulnerable. And like, again, like this is very like baby step stuff, right? Like I'm not there talking about my childhood traumas or anything like that, right? Like this is, it's very corporate stuff. And, you know, mostly humor. Like that's honestly the best. For me, that's like the easiest way to like get people to loosen up. Yeah.
So how do you strike that balance between being personal and not being too personal?
I overstep it sometimes and realize it.
So when you say you overstep it, how do you feel like you overstep it? Like how do you know you've gone too far?
Oh yeah, totally. Well, I think about it too much the next day. Right? I'd be like, oh my God, I can't believe I said that. And yeah, and there's just like, I've got a small list, but I've got a list of things that I've said or done in chats or wherever, and I feel embarrassed by them. So I keep that list in mind.
Is there any sort of like like not to pry into like your embarrassing things you've done, but like is there like a theme that matches sort of like connects all of these embarrassing things?
I get embarrassed by like if I say things that I feel are culturally not sensitive. That's one that sticks with me. Maybe too much personal information. I think I have kids, and we love sharing about kids, but sometimes it's much, and like not everyone has kids, right? And so it's not a universal thing. One thing I do like to talk about is, or I forgot to talk about, was pet channels. So I worked at a workplace where there was a pet channel. In a lot of ways, this to me was like perfect corporate personal edge, right? Like it's like your pets are very personal to you. They're parts of your household, but they're also so apolitical, right? Like there's just like they're fine, and you just show pictures of your pets, and it's a way that people can express themselves and show some of their home to their coworkers without intruding on their coworkers in any way.
That's what we do as well. We have several Slack channels where, like we have the general social channel, and then we also have one that's like specific to family life where people often share about their kids. Sometimes their pets there too, but we also have one that's more like wildlife where people are sharing about either their pets or the deer in their backyard or whatever. And we have like, you know, a more like food and cooking related channel and things like that where people can be more social, but it's more subject matter specific so that you're not sharing that with every single person if they really don't care.
Cool. Anything else? Yeah.
One of the challenges I find, especially with things like chat, is like I find focus is a pretty scarce resource throughout the day, and so like things like chat, which like grab your immediate focus, things like meetings, which require people to like stay focused for an hour. What's your experience been with things doing remote work, but also trying to preserve focus and give people time for like deep focused work?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I tend to not bother. I personally don't get bothered by distraction. I just like thrive in it. Yeah, I mean, I'll turn my notifications off for a period of time. That's about it. I think it's yeah. I don't do a lot of direct messages for that reason, like I talked about, because I feel like then I'm like grabbing someone by the lapels and like grabbing their attention. So I try to not do that.
Something that I think Teams actually does allow is you can have software plugged into it or some sort of thing that will like run like a week in advance of all your meetings and find large blocks of focus time, pre-populate them as meetings that turn off all your notifications.
Nice.
And so it can like carve that out. So like a week in advance, it will be like, okay, we found 5 hours that we are turning off all notifications for you. And you can always delete it or toggle them back on, but it's like an automatic process. I don't know how it was set up. It just was existing in there when I had hopped into it.
That sounds.
It seemed
super
really
useful.
helpful. So I guess 1 point for Teams. Just one.
I mean, I think Teams could be used. It's just everybody use it wrong. Like I don't know. I get every time I use Teams. I'm like, why aren't we using the Teams part of Teams? And like, nobody uses that part. So.
Yeah. I mean, some people try at my work. So
Yeah.
there's honest attempts.
My understanding is that it's often tied directly to AD credentials, like what teams you're in. So there's like a technical backend part I don't understand at all, but it's not as simple as spinning up a new channel in Slack.
Funny enough, I think part of the problem too is that it's when you post something in the Teams channel, it doesn't create notifications in the same way it does in other types of messages. So there's been several teams where like someone says something that's relevant to me, but like I don't think to check it. And I find out like 2 weeks later, I was like, oh, that's nice.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming.